Hello everybody, welcome to our interns debate. The subject for debate tonight is the influence of the United States on Australian climate policy. Our 5 interns and 1 intern coordinator will debate the proposition, will US action on climate change lead Australia to adopt more ambitious policies? Each of our 6 speakers will have 8 minutes for their address, and following their addresses, our adjudicator, Kevin Borum, will deliver his judgments. I'm not going to say any more. I don't want to waste any more time, so it's over to the first speaker for the affirmative.
Good evening and welcome to those joining us both in person and online. It's no secret that the Australian government has been widely derided for its lack of action on climate change. In stark contrast to many of its international peers, Australia has no concrete net zero emissions target. Prime Minister Morrison has made no new medium-term commitments to achieve greater emissions reductions by 2030. This past week, the government even pledged $600 million for a new gas-fired power plant in New South Wales. These examples only highlight Australia's status as a visible laggard on the world stage when it comes to climate action. However, we, the affirmative team, believe that the election of President Biden, and with it, a renewed US focus on the strategic and economic necessity for climate action, will eventually force Australia to adopt more ambitious climate policies. As first speaker, I will discuss how Biden sees climate change and national security as interdependent concerns, limiting the extent to which Australia can distance itself from US climate ambition. Our second speaker, Alice, will discuss how Biden's climate agenda will reorient international trade and financial flows, expediting Australia and the world's transition to renewable sources of energy. Our third speaker, Chris, will summarize our case. Tonight, we will demonstrate that Australia has no choice but to join Biden and the rest of the world in combating the climate crisis. Ideological or political indifference may delay this process, but it cannot stop the inevitable global transition to a future free from fossil fuels. So let's talk about Biden, his climate agenda, and how it impacts Australia. On January 27, the newly elected president signed an executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. The order clearly stipulates that climate considerations will be an essential element of US foreign policy and national security. There are 2 aspects of Biden's executive order that will directly impact Australia, particularly in the context of our alarmingly fractious relations with China and an increasing dependency on the US for regional security. Firstly, the US is looking to formulate a climate finance plan, using bilateral and multilateral channels to help developing countries reduce emissions, protect critical ecosystems, and build resilience towards the impacts of climate change. Biden has also indicated he intends to prohibit the Export-Import Bank and the US International Development Finance Corporation from financing new coal-fired power plants. Reducing global emissions is clearly a significant goal of the climate finance plan, but it also serves an equally important geostrategic function, combating China's strategic gains in the Indo-Pacific via the Belt and Road Initiative. China has been investing heavily in developing countries, financing large-scale infrastructure projects. China's objectives are twofold. They want to expand export markets, but also acquire soft power, the exercise of which can shield them from accountability in multilateral settings. Accordingly, the US wants to offer Belt and Road recipient countries alternative sources of development finance for clean energy investments, thereby increasing their own leverage in the Indo-Pacific. US development financing not only disincentivizes developing nations from assenting to new Belt and Road projects, but rallying other countries to improve their emission standards will pressure China to reduce their carbon footprint for existing projects under the scheme. It should also be noted that climate change disproportionately affects socioeconomic development in smaller, poorer nations, making them more susceptible to China's infrastructure proposals. Accordingly, attending to the climate crisis is integral to bolstering US security interests. The Australian government has similarly looked to China's Belt and Road Initiative with a high degree of anxiety. They see Belt and Road as a vehicle through which China aims to cement its influence and commercial interests across the region via debt trap diplomacy. The federal government even scrapped Victoria's Belt and Road Agreement with China, with ministers privately warning that allowing the deal to go ahead would dilute Australia's attempts to discourage other regional actors from signing investment deals with China. Therefore, if the US and Australia are in alignment on the perceived threat of expanding Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific, it stands to reason that both countries will converge on a strategy underpinned by climate financing to offset China's regional gains. After all, the US is Australia's primary security benefactor in the region. This would also lead Australia to adopt more ambitious climate policies domestically. It would be imprudent for Australia to promote the benefits of clean energy investments overseas while continuing to invest in fossil fuels at home. Such duality would do serious damage to Australia's carefully curated reputation as a responsible middle power and erode our bilateral relationships in the region. Secondly, under the aforementioned executive order, the US Secretary of Defense will soon be required to present a climate risk analysis to Biden that can be incorporated into defense modeling, simulations, and wargaming. In prescribing this action, Biden is placing climate change at the forefront of the Pentagon's national defense strategy. This demonstrates a growing recognition of how higher temperatures, extreme weather events, and rising sea levels alter the physical environment in which defense personnel operate. More importantly, climate change has the potential to exacerbate social instability, drive large-scale migration, and trigger violent conflicts. This will dictate how and where countries' defense spending and strategic resources are allocated in the future. Biden's order sees Australia playing catch-up. Former Chief of Defense Admiral Chris Barry has gone on record that, quote, climate security risks are not being fully assessed or understood in Australia. Further, the recently established Australian Security Leaders Climate Group, made up of 30 current and former defense personnel and security sector staff, have called for a national reassessment of the national security risks posed by climate change. This reassessment is now more likely than ever, especially as both Australia and the US increasingly work in tandem on their security and defense strategies. For example, the US and Australia partake in large-scale naval exercises together to improve each country's maritime capabilities and interoperability. Therefore, an increased US focus on climate security risks will naturally flow into Australia's defense preparations and operations, especially for key flashpoint issues like Taiwan and the South China Sea. This will also underline the necessity for Australia to help reduce global emissions to mitigate environmental variables that could undermine both our regional security and national security interests. Amid a rapid deterioration of relations with China, Australia's dependence on the US has never been higher. Some have even claimed that Australia is merely an Indo-Pacific outpost of American interests. Within this paradigm, it is untenable for both countries to have aligned security policies, but divergent perspectives and responses to the issue of climate change. As the Biden administration foregrounds climate action in its regional grand strategy and its joint operations, Australia will definitely face a strategic imperative to respond and thereby adopt a more ambitious climate agenda. Thanks.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. In response to the affirmative position, where it is argued that Australia will be pushed into adopting more ambitious climate policies based upon increased US climate action, it is our purpose to demonstrate that this is a fundamentally misguided view. I will begin by surveying the US domestic environment in which the supposed increased action is to take place. Our second speaker will cover economic and diplomatic considerations, and our third speaker will consolidate these arguments to reaffirm our position that only concerted, multilateral, and multifaceted pressure against Australia will influence it to bring its policies in line with more ambitious climate commitments. The first speaker of the affirmative side has attempted to argue that how Biden sees climate change and security issues will constitute the force that will give Australia no choice but to join Biden. However, what is needed by the US's part is being avoided: confrontation with the powerful industries responsible, redistribution from the rich, and massive public investment based on job guarantees, as echoed by Matt Huber, Assistant Professor of Geography at Syracuse University. The notion of increased US climate action cannot be accepted without a critical engagement with the assumption that such a position implies. That assumption being that US administration, led by President Joe Biden, has the leverage to actually affect real change on the climate front. How can Australia be pressured to adopt more ambitious climate policies when supposed increased US action on climate change is not ambitious in and of itself? Whilst it can be acknowledged that the prospects for US climate change action have improved with the election of an administration that has said it is committed to putting climate action front and centre, rejoining the Paris Agreement, revoking the federal licence for the Keystone XL oil pipeline project, and scrutinising the deregulation of carbon-emitting companies under the Trump administration are grossly insufficient actions. In an April article written by ABC North America correspondent Barbara Miller, it is noted that Australia's current ambitions are about half the size of the revised US goal, that being a 50 to 52% decrease by 2030 on 2005 levels of greenhouse gas emissions. Here, the phrase US goal is instructive because the Biden administration has promised to exercise global leadership in supporting the Paris Agreement. Though such leadership is of little value when US domestic action is far from ambitious and is in fact delusional. In comparison to an Australian federal government report of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions reducing by about 22% since 2005, the US has only achieved a 10% reduction in the same period, according to the US Environmental Protection Agency. At Biden's climate summit, Prime Minister Scott Morrison did not announce any revolutionary actions that Australia would be taking to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. A Conversation article suggesting such announcements may take place at the upcoming UN Climate Change Conference in November. Nevertheless, what is apparent is that Australia does not appear pressured by current and forecasted US rhetoric on taking decisive climate action, as we have seen by consecutive conservative and centrist leanings in this country, which our second speaker will discuss. The US has gradually suffered a decline in its power, and the notion of US exceptionalism and hegemony is now tarnished by domestic and international incidents. Of late, the US's failure to acknowledge and respond under the Trump administration to the COVID-19 pandemic. We must seriously ask the question, how can we expect the US to exercise enough global leadership on ambitious climate action to the extent that it can force Australia's hand when its current trajectory is hardly going to place itself in a position to reach the Paris targets? A New York Times comparative piece on international responses to climate change provides a strong argument for US action to be described as complacent at best and shameful at worst. In 2019, there were 130 US Congress members who denied or doubted climate change. Data taken from the Emission Database for Global Atmospheric Research shows that the US, in comparison to other states, is a leader in carbon emissions, sitting at 15.52 emissions per capita. According to the US Environmental Protection Agency, only 32% of US rubbish is recycled, over half going to landfill, contributing 12% to global waste levels. Even the banning of single-use plastic bags is not even widespread in the US, not to mention reports of unethical and unsustainable exporting of rubbish. And whilst it may be said that it is still early days and increased US action is possible or will be forthcoming, the issue is that it is rather a case of too little too late, significantly affecting the US's capacity to force international responses. The Biden administration cannot distinguish itself on the world stage with the all too familiar industry-friendly half measures that Australia is also guilty of. What could influence more ambitious climate action on Australia's part would be the Green New Deal supported by New York Congresswoman Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and Massachusetts Senator Ed Markey. The Green New Deal, as opposed to a mere climate finance plan, offers a more robust and ambitious plan, an elimination of US greenhouse gas emissions within 10 years, and job security, universal healthcare, and education. However, it has been decisively rejected under the previous administration, and it also does not face much hope of becoming a legislative, state-supported framework under the Biden administration. The bottom line is that increased US action has not and is unlikely to demonstrate enough push for Australia to adopt more ambitious climate policies. It faces a significantly compromised domestic environment, incapable of even attaining what may be deemed increased action, reinforcing our position that only concerted, multilateral, and multifaceted pressure against Australia will influence it to bring its policies in line with more ambitious climate commitments. Thank you.
President Biden has advanced bold ambitions to foreground climate responsibility across his administration's multilateral engagements. Still reeling from natural disasters and a pandemic that has increased our reliance on our international partners, perpetuating climate policies that alienate Australia from our peers is increasingly untenable. As the international community, under Biden's leadership, progressively imposes greater punishments on climate laggards, the economic and reputational precariousness that ensues will patently force Australian policymakers to reimagine prevailing climate strategies. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight, I will be examining the Biden administration's potential to directly penalise Australia's negligible environmental commitments. Firstly, through proposed reforms to trade and investment, and secondly, through the ramifications of non-compliance for Australia's reputation as a responsible middle power. Before I begin my case, I would like to make 4 contentions with the oppositions related to their claims about the US domestic environment, their potential for leadership, their leverage, and about the general nature of Australia's approach. On the first point, the first speaker made the claim that the US domestic environment is inherently geared against making substantive climate actions. I would like to make the point that Biden has enormous capacity as president, firstly to rule by executive order, secondly the fact that he has a unified legislature, and the fact that there is a consensus within the Democratic Party that climate change is their signature issue. I think they dramatically mischaracterize the amount of political capital that the climate issue now has in the American political discourse. Secondly, I think they underestimate the rhetorical importance of presidential leadership. The fact that Biden has consistently emphasized this across every initiative and made it his signature issue, and that this communication is foregrounded in his communications with both the public and the international community, has enormous implications for the domestic environment and their hospitality to change. Also on this point, I think that Biden's executive order, as I will continue my case, has made substantial commitments to engage with the commercial sector in ways that have tangible short-term goals as well as long-term commitments associated with them. So claiming that domestic environment is fundamentally inhospitable is a mischaracterization. Second of all, the opposition has made the claim that the US goals themselves aren't ambitious. While I think this detracts from the core focus of the debate, I think that it is evident that Biden has taken a much stronger position than previous administrations, and while there is, as the opposition has said, a complacent history, I don't think they give enough credit to the fact that Biden is obviously exiting a Trump administration that was disengaged. He is hoping to inaugurate a period of change and increasing his ambition in accordance with that philosophy. So talking about America's historic position is somewhat irrelevant from the substantive matter that Biden hopes to pursue in his legislative agenda. On the third point, that America doesn't have sufficient leverage given their current leadership position, as I'll discuss in my case, initiatives like carbon border tax and exclusions from multilateral engagements are substantive penalties that the US has the capacity to implement. But on the point that the US is no longer in a sufficient leadership position, I would like to say that the very importance of this issue is that it's a thing that the US is staking its leadership claim on. It is returning to international leadership through recommitting to the Paris Climate Accords based on the fact that it is able to contribute substantively to collective action on climate change. So I think that the fact that the US is so invested in reinventing their leadership around this issue will be what makes it impactful. And secondly, that the US actually continues to have important normative power within, firstly, multilateral institutions, which is where most of these climate discourses take place, and also through their expansive alliance network. So saying that the US doesn't have sufficient leverage to enforce these changes is fundamentally mistaken. My last rebuttal that I'd like to raise is their claim that the Australian refusal to make commitments at this initial climate summit is reflective of some broad refusal to do any climate action. I think that is certainly speaking too soon, only a few months into Biden's administration, in the infancy of considering how his policies will progress. I think that Australia has taken a sort of wait-and-see attitude. As the penalties become more pronounced that Biden is able to implement, I think we can expect more action. And I think that they also mischaracterize that Australia has totally been stagnant. I think that there have been subtle changes that we've observed in recent years in the Australian climate discourse, including their transition away from coal to a natural gas-fired recovery, and the $50 million of renewable investments that were made in the budget, as well as other initiatives related to natural disaster resilience that inherently tie Australia to climate conversations. So, on to my case. My first point this evening is that Biden's reorienting of global trade will affix Australia's economic security to its climate ambition. Biden has proposed comprehensive trade reforms to bolster the climate resilience of supply chains, ship American-made clean energy products, and importantly, to lower carbon leakage by implementing carbon border tax adjustments. This excise on countries that don't tax heavy polluters is poised to handicap Australia's trading position. Australia is an export-dependent economy, as we all know, and is deeply integrated into global trading systems. It is especially vulnerable due to its export of commodities with high carbon content. Even if America itself failed to fully implement these measures within the 4-year Biden administration, his rhetoric has had an enormously influential activating impact on many of Australia's other trading partners. The European Union has approved a proposed carbon border tax affecting more than $20 billion of Australian exports. The United Kingdom, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan are considering similar measures or instituting carbon intensity product markets that price carbon into the value of traded goods. While China isn't currently pursuing these measures, their increasingly concrete emissions targets and the reality that they can develop goodwill with the US around this issue means that it's important to acknowledge that China's position may change. Therefore, the embedding of climate responsibility in trading interactions will compel Australian policymakers to act, or Australia's economic prosperity will suffer. Moreover, Biden administration environmental reforms to investments in finance will create a commercial case for Australian businesses to pursue climate action. Biden's executive order on climate includes reforms to the financial sector, which will have immediate impacts set to be implemented within 120 days. These reforms are in part aimed at ending fossil fuel financing abroad, cutting off Australia's fossil fuel industry from the North American banks that have accounted for more than 50% of their funding since the 2015 Paris climate deal. Additionally, Australia's businesses and banks' ability to function domestically will be impaired on the basis of climate-based lending rules in the American financial sector. 6 of the largest banks in the United States have vowed to align their lending portfolio with Paris Agreement stipulations, with Biden's encouragement. Most importantly, American foreign direct investment, which amounts to nearly 25% of all FDI into Australia, will increasingly become conditional upon environmental responsibility. Biden's executive order directs Labor Secretary Marty Welsh to cancel or revise rules from the Trump administration that allowed investment firms to neglect climate risk when making investment decision-making. In this context, surrounded by foreign trading partners, investors, and a local commercial sector that is committed to climate responsibility as a result of Biden's policies, the Australian government will undoubtedly face commercial pressure to presume a more active climate agenda. The final point I want to raise this evening pertains to the unprecedented reputational damage Australian climate policies will cause, undercutting the country's foreign policy agenda at every level. As Biden's success at driving collective action on climate change, as I've stated, is intrinsically related both to Democrats' re-electability and to America's leadership position more broadly, they expect Australia to capitulate. John Kerry specifically acknowledged the enormous potential for joint work between the two countries in his Paris climate address. While years of distractions have prevented Australia from facing the real reputational damage for its policies, there are clear indications that expectations have changed. Asked whether Australia has an image problem, Australian Ambassador to the US, Senator Dinos, agreed, stating, because we've had the climate wars, with prime ministers losing their jobs, they see this as a politically fraught issue for us. Australia's dependence upon carryover credits has invited resistance from more than 100 countries, and Boris Johnson recently excluded Australia from a climate leaders summit. The United Nations is undertaking a review of Australia's human rights record, considering the potential damage done to citizens by climate negligence. The implications of this position are set to bleed over into other issue areas, including G7, G20, and all other fora related to aviation, shipping, the ocean, sustainable development, and migration. President Biden is manifestly prepared to exert pressure on allies. Under his policies, it is apparent that the reputational and economic cost of inaction for Australia will not be bearable. Thank you.
Good evening. Firstly, I would like to respond to the arguments of the affirmative team. The affirmative team would have us believe that climate and security are intrinsically linked, and that Australian security is at risk if we do not bring our policies into line. We argue that this is false. Indeed, if the US were to exercise such punitive pressure against one of its critical allies, so much so that Australian security was then at risk, this would damage US interests as much as Australia's, as I will go on to discuss. Secondly, the affirmative team would have us believe that carbon border taxes are a likely and viable policy. But just today, a New York Times article spoke of the enormous, and I quote, congressional hurdles to this policy, which I will also cover in my substantive argument. The second speaker also spoke of China, the EU, and the other states' growing economic climate pressures that could potentially be leveraged against Australia. But as this topic only covers US action specifically, these are tangential actors. Having responded to the arguments of the affirmative team, I will now move on to our case. In this speech, I will discuss what increased US action against Australia might look like and prove that whether it takes the form of diplomatic pressure, economic pressure, or both, that the US alone will be insufficient to force Australia to make more ambitious climate policies. Firstly, on the alleged economic pressure that the US may attempt to leverage, there is growing discussion of a carbon border adjustment mechanism that the affirmative team spoke of. It is similar to that being considered by the EU, and this would essentially apply a carbon tariff on Australian exports. And yet, even in this worst possible scenario of the highest kind of economic pressure that the US could leverage, such a policy would actually have little effect on Australia. The reason being that our exports to the US represent just 3.6% of total exports, and with modelling by Victoria University projecting that these exports would fall by less than 1.2% in the event of tariffs, the effects of this pressure are extremely minimal. This is a known fact within the government, with former Trade Minister Craig Emerson declaring the effects of carbon tariffs by America hardly worth mentioning. But now let us turn to whether carbon tariffs are actually a viable policy for the US to implement. The fact of the matter is that the US Congress, as I've mentioned, is unlikely to approve a price on carbon. Therefore, for the Biden administration to implement carbon tariffs against other countries, it would put the US in violation of World Trade Organization rules on protectionism. And though Biden's predecessor might have exhibited such proclivities, the current administration is a far sight less likely to do so. But what about diplomatic pressure? We have already seen Australia roundly criticised for its laggard climate policies by the US, but also the UN, the UK, EU, Pacific nations, and a whole host of other countries who've publicly and consistently made the same critiques for well over a decade now, but to no avail. The affirmative team will try to suggest that it is only a matter of time until Australia bows to our great and powerful friend, but it has not done so yet on climate policy, has so far refused to participate in freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, despite US urging since the Obama administration, and for a long time prioritised its own interests vis-a-vis China over Washington's preferences. Australia is not, therefore, the wholly docile partner in bilateral relations that the affirmative team would have us believe. However, we do acknowledge that diplomatic pressure from the US so far has largely been rhetorical and symbolic. But now let us imagine a scenario where diplomatic action against us goes beyond barbed comments and symbolic snubs and actually results in the freezing of ties, the suspension of ANZUS, and in hardcore diplomatic isolation. Such a scenario is troubling to Australia, but only if it were to ever actually occur. To understand why hardcore diplomatic isolation is so unlikely, the wider geopolitical landscape must be considered. in particular US-China competition and corollary tensions in the South China Sea and Taiwan, for example, that necessitate robust relations between the US and its allies. Once this wider context is considered, it prompts the question, is the US really likely to leverage such punitive pressure against one of its allies in a region where it needs all the friends it can get, knowing that to do so would undermine the credibility of the US's allied commitments and jeopardize the security architecture of the Quad, Five Eyes, and more? We would argue that the more likely scenario is that the current level of US diplomatic action against Australia that has so far proved ineffectual will continue, with any escalation highly unlikely and against the US's broader interests. With the lackluster effects of US economic and diplomatic pressure now illustrated, let us turn to the domestic hurdles in Australia that are the true hindrance to climate action and which make US pressure comparatively powerless. Indeed, the sad fact of the matter is that the Australian economy is so heavily reliant on energy exports, so much so that it will take more economic pressure than America is able to leverage for Australia to capitulate. With coal Australia's largest export commodity, and fossil fuels accounting for more than a quarter of exports in 2018, it becomes easy to see why US pressure will ultimately be insufficient to force change. More importantly, Australia is hamstrung politically by the country's fossil fuel industry. Indeed, support for these industries is infused in the DNA of our political parties. Morrison, of all people, knows this. After all, Morrison, of all people, knows the cost of not kowtowing to the fossil fuel line, having come to power through the demise of Malcolm Turnbull, famously brought down over energy politics. Now, with the country's most influential industry and lobby groups actively working to stifle climate action, and our major political parties reliant on and benefiting from over $85 million of carbon-laced donations in 2018, the question is not when Australia will enact climate policies, but rather will they, knowing full well that political fates hang in the balance of the storm that is surely brewing. The list goes on, but the fact remains. Increased US action and therefore pressure, whether that is diplomatic, economic, or both, will not be sufficient in the face of domestic impediments to climate action. Prime Minister Morrison summarised this best in his statement that, quote, Australia's climate policies won't be set in the United Kingdom. They won't be set in Brussels. Indeed, they won't be set in any part of the world other than here. Thank you.
Good evening, and I would like to thank the opposing team for their arguments, but I would like to deconstruct them. But first, before that, I would like to wrap up as the final speaker my colleagues' arguments. And the first argument by Sanjay is that Australia has no choice, simply. Australia is coalesced with the US in security, and the rise of green leadership will naturally flow into strategic discourse. Now, the US is at the forefront of regional leadership, and we want to be a part of that regional leadership. So it's unwise and unavoidable that we'll have to start changing our narratives. And as the rise of China starts to threaten our alliances and it starts to threaten our position in the Asia-Pacific, Australia simply doesn't want to amplify its anxiety by going against the US trends. It simply just doesn't want that, so that there needs to be a strategic change, and there will be. And the second argument is willingness and capability. So the international community is moving on, despite Australia's ideological stances, besides the Liberal Party ideological standards, ideological perspectives, the international community is simply moving on. It's inevitable that businesses will start to implement green policies because it's in their economic interest. And this will create an irrefutable commercial case for Australia's businesses to follow suit. And this will ultimately cut across the multilateral agenda. So now, wrapping up these arguments, I'd like to move on to rebuttal my opposing team. And the first is about US domestic environment. So my colleagues on the opposing side say that there's not enough change on the domestic front to influence Australia, but I will fundamentally disagree. While there might not be changes right now, the domestic structure is being changed. It's fundamentally ambitious. Biden's plans are fundamentally ambitious, and they propose a fundamental restructuring of the economy, which sets irrevocable changes despite who's going to take over. It's setting the starting lines, and it's building the finishing lines, and no one's going to stray off that path because the foundations are simply changing. And the second thing is that restructuring takes time. My opposing team doesn't seem to have a logical understanding of it. Time, that is. It's only been a little over 100 days. It's only been a little over 100 days, and so much has been done. So we can't look at what kind of national reductions of carbon emissions have been done, because it's only been 100 days. These are fundamental restructurings. And in terms of the Green New Deal, now we know that the Green New Deal is, it's a great policy, but it's not being pursued. So Biden has to be practical and he has to be reasonable. And what he's done is he's absorbed the fundamental elements of the Green New Deal to make it politically feasible. And what he's done, most importantly, is he's changed the discursive power of the national and international narrative. Will Australia fall out of the narrative that has defined its very identity? That is a responsible Western power at the forefront of the rules-based order. US policy has always been empowering the multilateral agenda. And economic measures, penalties against Australia, it's true, it probably won't do much, sure. But it's the strategic discourse that will change. It's the fundamental image that Australia doesn't want to be in, and that's a laggard. That is going to be not in lockstep with our fundamental partner. And I would like to raise another argument, and that this change from Biden is fundamentally changing the domestic narrative in Australia too. So opposition parties in Australia as well have been feeded political capital to fire against the Liberal Party to change discourse. So even if Scott Morrison might not change his policy within the next 2 weeks or so, the agenda is changing, the narrative is changing. The opposition sees that, and it's using that masterfully to undercut any ideological positions that we need to stay in coal. So, US pressure will not change our policies straight away, but it will start the change. And I raise this: if it wasn't for Biden, would we even be having this conversation in the first place? This very debate shows that the conversation is changing, that people are starting to have these conversations, and we're being empowered by the fundamental change in the US. So I'd like to wrap it up there, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the remarks. Thank you.
Good evening. The affirmative teams led us to believe a lot of interesting presumptions. They've led us to believe that the US has some incredible form of discursive power over the international realm that will push the entire world into action. They question our view of time and how much time it will take for the US to transform its action from 5 years under the Trump administration. But I question their assumptions about time. How much time is needed when we're already approaching 2 degrees increase in global emissions, how much time will it take for the Biden administration to move to concrete measures over the discursive power and words that we've heard so much about from the affirmative team? I'd first like to rebut a few points made by the affirmative side. The first affirmative speaker suggested that Australia will follow the US in promoting clean energy investment in the region in order to counteract the influence of China and China's Belt and Road Initiative. However, this seems hugely unlikely from our point of view, when Australia's largest export is coal, valued at $68 billion a year. Australia recently overtook Saudi Arabia to become the world's largest exporter of liquid natural gas in the world. Why would it be in our interest to follow the US line when it's patently against our trade interests in the region? The second affirmative speaker made a point that painted the Biden administration as having substantial commitments. But as we've already substantiated, the US faces huge domestic hurdles to actually implement Biden's policies and currently doesn't have a domestic price on carbon. We heard that the US rhetoric is changing the international sphere, that the EU, Japan, and China are following US action, following US leadership. But this is clearly just not the case. The EU was the first to move on a carbon border adjustment mechanism. The US is lagging behind and catching up, perhaps just like us. Indeed, we would agree that it's Asian partners, Asian trading partners like Japan, like China, who will be the impactful movers, the trade partners who will truly be able to apply multilateral and concerted pressure on Australia and perhaps force us into action. And so while the affirmative team has argued that US action on climate will be sufficient to force Australia into more ambitious climate commitments, this is clearly not the case because, as our first speaker has laid out, US action in itself is insufficient to force any country to adopt more ambitious climate policies. The current supposed increased action by the US is just not ambitious enough. They're lagging behind on climate policies, and the current US rhetoric is just not backed up by adequate actions and policies. Viewed in the broader context of diminishing US power, that the US could pressure Australia into more ambitious climate action is hugely questionable. Indeed, their very lack of a carbon price domestically might bar them completely from exerting any economic pressure on Australia. We heard the second affirmative speaker mention a carbon border adjustment mechanism, but the US's lack of a domestic price on carbon precludes completely the possibility of the US implementing punitive climate tariffs, as World Trade Organization rules would explicitly ban any such protectionist measures. This is as America's weak domestic policies on climate mean there is absolutely no question of fairness in protecting their own industries or of carbon leakage, because it's simply the case that the US cannot tax high-polluting imports while it doesn't tax its own high-polluting domestic production. Doing so would not only be hugely hypocritical, but also be blatantly in contravention of World Trade Organization rules. And even in the highly unlikely event that the US moves dramatically on the domestic front and implements ambitious policies, which include a carbon price domestically and then implements carbon tariffs, in this hugely unlikely scenario, this would have little effect at all on Australia economically, because the US only makes up a tiny, tiny proportion of our exports. And these exports are dwarfed by our major trading partners in Asia, who would have to be the source of any concerted multilateral pressure that would be able to force Australia into more ambitious climate commitments. Any diplomatic pressure that has already been levied against Australia thus far has been hugely ineffective in changing the government's line. it's unclear why our reputational image, which has been damaged for over a decade now on the international stage, would be worth protecting now at this juncture when we're still so dependent on our fossil fuel exports. It seems that Australia's symbolic isolation, not only by the US, but also by the UN, the UK, and our Pacific neighbours, has had next to no effect. Indeed, would the US really want to alienate one of its closest allies in its security alliance over climate issues? It's unlikely, but even if it did, it's extremely unlikely to have any effect whatsoever. We've been roundly criticized over and over again, and the effect has been nothing. Moreover, it's clear that our current political landscape is paralyzed on climate issues, with major parties dependent on fossil fuel funding for their campaigns and for their political capital. The Australian government is too hamstrung by fossil fuel interests, and as a result, US action simply won't be effective in pushing Australia to adopt more ambitious climate policies. Moreover, increased US pressure is unlikely to have any substantial effect because there's simply not a sufficiently large export market. And their diplomatic pressure has been completely and utterly ignored for decades. So to conclude, US action on climate change is just not sufficient to pressure Australia into adopting a more ambitious climate policy. It will take multilateral, concerted economic pressure from our more important trade partners in Asia in order to force Australia's hand on ambitious climate policies. Thank you.
While our adjudicator, Kevin, takes a few minutes to finalise his thoughts, let me just say that we plan to continue our current pattern of alternating online events like our event tonight and issuing our newsletter columns from Glover Cottages. That means that next week, round about the 1st of June, we'll be issuing columns once again, and on the 8th of June our speaker will be Dr. Ross McLennan from Macquarie University. He's going to address the question of the operation of the foreign influence legislation on Australian universities. But I think now our adjudicator is ready to go.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Ian, and thank you to both teams for a very well-informed debate on these important issues and bringing up some important points which might not be immediately obvious to anyone confronting this topic, particularly the affirmative case about the relationship between climate change, US security policy and our own security interests. I thought that both teams gave us a good deal to think about and put forward their cases in a cogent and persuasive way. I thought that the affirmative got off to a very strong start by dealing with the relationship between climate change and security, both in terms of the way that changes in the climate give rise to security problems, but also the posture of the current US administration making a clear link between security issues and climate change, and indeed seeking to undermine China's efforts in their Belt and Road Initiative by seeking to support climate action in developing countries and undermine what the Chinese are trying to do. I thought that these points were made very clearly by Sanjay in setting out the affirmative case, and it was possibly not foreseen by the negative that the affirmative would start out by dealing with security issues rather than the more emotional green issues which some people may think about when they think about how we would deal with the issue of climate change. So I thought this was a very strong start by the affirmative. I thought, though, that the second and third speakers for the affirmative didn't entirely pick up this security theme and hammer away at it, even though even though Alice made a notable effort to fit in an hour's lecture into the time that was available for this debate. I thought that although she made some important points rebutting the affirmative case, which I'll come back to, there needed to be a somewhat stronger emphasis on the security theme, both by Alice and by Chris. So I thought that the affirmative started out very strongly in a way which the negative may not have anticipated, but needed to follow through on the start that they made in a more consistent fashion. The negative also made some significant and useful points. The analysis by the first and second speakers of the US domestic scene was quite persuasive and was a useful way of rebutting the case that the affirmative, of course, was making, that we need to follow what the US is doing, and in suggesting that the US, in fact, may not in the end do very much. That was a useful negative point that the negative case made, and in particular I thought that the way that the second negative speaker dealt with the issue of carbon tariffs was quite persuasive in suggesting that they may not happen, and in any case carbon tariffs imposed by the US would not have very much effect on Australia's economic interests. So I thought that the negative made some useful points in undermining the affirmative case that we had to take what the US is doing on climate change seriously. I thought, though, that the first negative speaker needed to pick up this security theme, which the first affirmative speaker had laid out quite persuasively, and knock that on the head straight away. And in the sense that that not dealing with the security theme, I thought that was a slight weakness in the negative case. And also, just making a general point about debates, and as anyone who's been a debater knows, one of the difficulties is, of course, that you have to listen to what the other side is saying. Of course, one doesn't do that. You're thinking about what you are going to say yourself, or you're simmering down after speaking, so you don't listen to what the other side is saying. And I thought that the negative needed to pick up and rebut this security theme a bit more conclusively. However, as I say, I think the negative made some useful and persuasive points, particularly in dealing with the actual possibility of the US developing and pursuing effective climate change policies given the weaknesses in the American domestic political system. So I thought that both sides dealt very effectively with these issues, made some significant points. I thought that the affirmative started very strongly, and while I wouldn't criticise the contributions that Alice and Chris made, I thought that the security theme, as I say, needed to be pursued a bit more consistently. But I thought the affirmative did start out quite strongly, did successfully rebut some of the points made by the negative, particularly in dealing with the ways in which the Biden administration may be able, through executive orders and other means, pursue effective climate change policies, even given the likely congressional resistance. So I thought those points that were made by Alice were quite effective. So the affirmative case started strongly, made some useful rebuttal points, perhaps needed to be a little more consistent in the way that it pursued the points which the first speaker's case rested on. The negative, I thought, made some useful points in pointing to the difficulties that the Biden administration will face in adopting policies itself, and in that sense would be seen to be hypocritical and ineffective in trying to pressure Australia. So I thought there were some good negative points made, but I thought that the negative needed to grapple with the case which the first affirmative had made a little more effective. I thought that you were expecting a more emotional case from the affirmative, and when you didn't get it, and this is what negative teams always tend to do, you talked as though they'd made that sort of emotional case. So, as I say, one of the most difficult things in debating is to listen to what the other side is saying and respond to it. So, although I thought that the negative made some quite effective points in undermining the cogency of the affirmative case, particularly resting on the assumption that the Biden administration will be effective in pursuing climate change policies, I was, in the end, persuaded that the affirmative had started strongly, as I say, needed perhaps to follow that point through more consistently. The negative made some useful points in pointing to the flimsiness of some of the assertions that the affirmative made about what the US was likely to be able to do. But I thought that the affirmative case in the end persuaded me a little more effectively, perhaps hopefully, and so I'd award the debate to the affirmative, but underline the fact that the negative case made some useful and persuasive points in undermining the affirmative case, but which nevertheless I think just carried the day by a narrow margin.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And warmest thanks to our audience, both here in Glover Cottages, but especially online, for joining us tonight. To round off our evening, I'd like to move, by acclamation, a vote of thanks to all 6 of our debaters.